The morning of my wedding began like any military operation I'd ever run. Precise timing, careful preparation, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of training. My dress blues hung crisp and ready on the closet door, each ribbon positioned with mathematical accuracy. The early sunlight caught the gold trim and sent small reflections dancing across my apartment walls. I had chosen to wear my navy uniform not as a statement, but as truth. After 15 years of service, those colors had become more than fabric. They were my identity. My phone buzzed against the nightstand. A single message that would shatter the carefully constructed morning I had planned. The screen displayed 5 words that hit harder than any battlefield briefing I'd ever received. "We're not coming. Stay away. Dad." I stared at those words until they blurred. The phone trembled in my hands, though my voice stayed steady when I read them aloud to the empty room. 15 years of proving myself, 15 years of earning respect in rooms where I was often the only woman, and my own father had chosen this moment to deliver his final verdict. I wasn't worth showing up for. The silence that followed felt heavier than my dress uniform. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, that familiar rhythm that had carried me through combat zones and congressional hearings alike. But this wasn't enemy fire or political pressure. This was something deeper, something that cut through every metal on my chest and found the little girl who used to polish his boots on Saturday mornings. I walked to my kitchen window and looked out at the Virginia morning. Somewhere across town, my fiancé Ethan was probably adjusting his tie and checking his watch. Somewhere else, my father was making his own choice about what mattered more, his pride or my happiness. The answer had arrived in 5 brutal words. Ethan Cole wasn't just the man I was marrying today. He was a federal agent who understood the weight of duty, the cost of service, and the particular loneliness that comes with wearing your country's uniform. When I handed him my phone 20 minutes later, his face didn't change. He read the message once, handed the device back, and simply said, "I'll handle this." I didn't ask what he meant. In our world, when someone says they'll handle something, you trust them. Ethan pulled out his phone and made 3 calls. Each conversation was brief, professional, measured. I caught fragments. "Yes, sir, this morning." "Understood. We'll need dress uniforms." When he finished, he looked at me with that calm expression I'd fallen in love with 2 years earlier. The first call was to his supervisor at the FBI. "Agent Cole, requesting personal leave extension," he said into the phone. "Family situation requires immediate attention. Authorization granted." The second call went to someone whose voice I couldn't quite make out through the speaker. "This is Cole. I need a favor. Today, 1400 hours. The chapel at Quantico. Dress blues." The third call lasted longer. When he hung up, Ethan straightened his shoulders the way federal agents do when they've just moved mountains with paperwork and protocol. "What did you do?" I asked quietly. He smiled, that half expression that had convinced me to trust him with my heart 3 years ago. "I made sure you won't walk down that aisle alone," he said. "Some people earn the right to stand beside you, others forfeit it. Today, the right people will be there." I spent the next hour getting ready with a strange mixture of heartbreak and anticipation. Every movement felt deliberate, buttoning my jacket, pinning my ribbons, adjusting my cover. These rituals had steadied me through deployments and ceremonies, through moments when the weight of responsibility threatened to crush me. Today, they would carry me through something different. Today, they would armor me against abandonment. The drive to the chapel felt longer than usual. Virginia, countryside rolled past my window in shades of green and gold. I thought about my mother, gone now for 5 years, and how she would have handled this morning. She had been the bridge between my father's rigid expectations and my own stubborn determination. Without her, that bridge had crumbled into silence and resentment. My father, Colonel Robert Lane, had spent my entire childhood teaching me that emotions were weakness, and approval was earned through performance. He measured love the way he measured everything else, by regulation, by achievement, by whether you met his impossible standards. When I chose the Navy over his beloved Army, I had committed the first sin. When I chose command over compliance, I had committed the second. Today, by choosing happiness over his approval, I had apparently committed the third and final transgression. The chapel parking lot was fuller than I expected. Cars I didn't recognize lined the spaces near the entrance. As I walked toward the doors, I noticed something that made my chest tighten with emotion. Standing near the entrance were two men in dress blues, their postures unmistakably military. Chief Petty Officer Martinez and Senior Chief Williams, both from my old command in Norfolk. They snapped to attention as I approached. "Ma'am," Martinez said, his voice carrying the respect I'd earned through years of leading by example rather than intimidation. "We thought you might need an escort." Williams nodded, his weathered face showing the kind of smile that comes from shared understanding. "Nobody walks alone today, Admiral." I felt something shift in my chest. Not sadness, but recognition. These men had traveled hours to stand with me. They understood what my father never could. That loyalty isn't inherited through blood. It's built through trust, through showing up when it matters, through choosing to see worth where others see weakness. Inside the chapel, sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, painting the wooden pews in colors that reminded me of sunrise at sea. The space smelled of polish and fresh flowers, of ceremony and reverence. As I walked down the aisle between Martinez and Williams, I noticed more faces than I'd expected. Fellow officers, agents from Ethan's bureau, even some of the sailors I'd commanded years ago. All of them had chosen to be here. The organ began its processional, and for the first time since reading that morning's message, I felt something other than hurt. I felt surrounded. Not by blood family, but by chosen family. The people who had seen me at my worst and decided I was worth fighting for. The people who understood that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show up for someone else's happiness. Ethan stood at the altar in his best suit, his FBI credentials replaced today by something more valuable. The promise that when the world tries to diminish you, the right person will stand beside you and refuse to let it happen. When our eyes met, he didn't smile. He simply nodded, the way partners do when they recognize that the mission has changed but the commitment remains the same. As I reached the front of the chapel, I realized that my father's absence had become something unexpected, not a wound, but a revelation. The uniform I wore, the people who surrounded me, the man who waited for me at the altar, all of it represented choices I had made. Paths I had walked without his approval or permission. Today wasn't about his rejection. Today was about my acceptance of a life I had built with my own hands. The chaplain began the ceremony, his voice steady and familiar. But before he could speak the traditional words, something happened that I will remember for the rest of my life. From the back of the chapel, a voice called out, clear and strong, "Admiral on deck." Every person in that sacred space rose to their feet in unison. The sound of chairs scraping, of bodies moving as one, of respect being paid not to rank, but to the person who had earned it. Had earned it. The silence that followed was absolute, not the empty quiet of abandonment, but the full silence of recognition. In that moment, I understood what Ethan's 3 phone calls had accomplished. He hadn't just invited people to a wedding. He had assembled a congregation of witnesses who knew what dedication looked like when it wore a uniform. The chaplain waited, his eyes moving across the assembled crowd with something approaching awe. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of ceremony mixed with genuine emotion. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today not just to witness a marriage, but to honor the bonds that truly matter. The bonds we choose, the bonds we earn, the bonds we forge through service and sacrifice." I felt Martinez shift slightly to my right, his presence solid and reassuring. Williams stood equally still to my left, both men understanding that their role went far beyond tradition. They were standing where family should have stood. Where blood had failed, Brotherhood had answered the call. As the ceremony continued, I found myself thinking about the morning's message in a different light. "We're not coming. Stay away." Those words had been meant to isolate me, to make me feel small and unwanted on what should have been the most important day of my life. Instead, they had revealed something profound about the difference between family by birth and family by choice. The chaplain asked for the rings, and Ethan reached into his jacket pocket. But before he could retrieve them, another voice spoke from the congregation. "With permission, sir." It was Commander Sarah Chen from my current assignment at the Pentagon. She stepped forward, carrying a small wooden box that I recognized immediately. It was made from timber taken from the USS Constitution, gifted to officers who had demonstrated exceptional leadership under pressure. "Admiral," she said formally, "the command staff wanted you to have something old to carry with you today." Inside the box were our original rings, but now they rested on a bed of blue silk that had been carefully cut from a retired Navy flag. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. We were binding our lives together with the same colors I had served under for 15 years. Ethan's hands were steady as he slipped the ring onto my finger, but I could see the emotion in his eyes. The weight of what we were doing, surrounded by people who understood the cost of commitment, gave the moment a gravity that no amount of family drama could diminish. When it was my turn to place his ring, I whispered words that only he could hear. "Thank you for the calls. Thank you for understanding that sometimes the family you build matters more than the family you're born into." The chaplain pronounced us husband and wife, and the applause that followed wasn't polite or restrained. It was the sound of approval from people who had earned the right to judge character. As we kissed for the first time as a married couple, I heard someone whistle sharply from the back row. The sound was immediately followed by a chorus of laughter and a few good-natured shouts of hooyah from the Navy contingent. But the most powerful moment came as we turned to walk back down the aisle. Without any prompting or coordination, the entire congregation began to applaud in rhythm. Not the scattered clapping of a typical ceremony, but the synchronized applause of military precision. The sound echoed off the chapel walls like a drumbeat, like the sound of boots marching in formation, like the heartbeat of an institution that had claimed me as its own. As we reached the chapel doors, I noticed something that made me pause. Standing just outside, partially hidden behind a stone pillar, was a figure in an army dress uniform. The distance and shadows made identification impossible, but the posture was unmistakable, rigid, formal, watching from a place where observation was possible but participation was not. Ethan saw him too. His hand tightened slightly on my arm, a silent question. I shook my head once, a small movement that communicated everything. Not today. Today belonged to the people who had chosen to be present, not to those who had chosen to remain on the margins. The reception was held in the Officers' Club at Quantico, a venue that Ethan had somehow secured with his mysterious third phone call. The room was decorated simply but elegantly, with navy blue and gold accents that honored my service without overwhelming the celebration. Tables were arranged to encourage mingling between the FBI agents and Navy officers, creating conversations that bridged the gap between federal law enforcement and military service. Chief Martinez found me during the cocktail hour, a glass of champagne in his weathered hands. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I wanted you to know that what happened today, what your husband arranged, it's going to be talked about for years. Not because of who wasn't here, but because of who was. You've got something special in that man." I looked across the room to where Ethan was deep in conversation with Commander Chen and two of his FBI colleagues. He had somehow managed to create connections between people who had never met, but shared a common understanding of what service meant. The sight filled me with a warmth that had nothing to do with the champagne I was holding. Senior Chief Williams approached with his wife, a kind-faced woman who had raised 4 children while her husband deployed around the world. She took my hands in hers and spoke with the authority that comes from decades of military life. "Honey," she said, "family isn't about blood. It's about showing up. Look around this room. This is your family, And it's a damn good one. The dinner that followed was unlike any wedding reception I had ever attended. Instead of the usual mix of awkward small talk and obligation, the conversations flowed with the easy camaraderie of people who understood each other's language. War stories were shared across tables, but so were stories of homecoming, of children's first steps missed and later celebrated, of the peculiar bond that forms between people who have sworn the same oath. When it came time for toasts, I expected the usual collection of embarrassing childhood stories and well wishes for the future. Instead, what followed was a series of testimonials that felt more like a promotion ceremony than a wedding reception. Agent Patricia Morrison from Ethan's FBI unit stood first, her voice clear and professional. "I've worked with Agent Cole for 6 years," she began, "and I've seen him handle international terrorists, organized crime figures, and congressional oversight committees. But I've never seen him as focused as he was this morning when he made those 3 phone calls. He moved heaven and earth to make sure that Admiral Lane would be surrounded by people who recognize her worth. That's the kind of partner we all deserve, and that's the kind of man who will make this marriage work." Commander Chen followed, her toast more personal but equally powerful. "Admiral Lane once told me that leadership isn't about commanding respect. It's about earning it one decision at a time. Today she made a decision to marry the man who understood that she deserved to be celebrated, not merely tolerated. To the Admiral and Agent Cole, may your partnership be as strong as your individual service to our country." But it was Chief Martinez who delivered the toast that brought tears to my eyes. He stood slowly, his dress blue uniform immaculate despite his 60-plus years. "Admiral Lane," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades in the Navy, "you once told a room full of junior officers that the measure of a leader isn't in how they handle success, but in how they respond when everything falls apart. This morning, everything could have fallen apart. Instead, you chose grace. You chose to focus on what you were building rather than what you were losing. That's why we follow you, ma'am. That's why we're here today. And that's why this marriage is going to succeed." The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, but it was the sight of hardened military veterans wiping their eyes that told the real story. These were people who had seen combat, who had buried friends, who understood the difference between empty ceremony and genuine emotion. Their presence validated something that I had always known but never fully articulated. Respect isn't inherited. It's earned through actions, decisions, and the courage to choose principle over convenience. As the evening wound down, Ethan and I stepped outside onto the club's terrace. The night air was crisp and clear, carrying the sound of distant traffic and the faint echo of laughter from inside. We stood together in comfortable silence, processing the events of a day that had begun with abandonment and ended with affirmation. "Your 3 phone calls," I said finally. "Tell me what they really accomplished." Ethan was quiet for a moment, his hand finding mine in the darkness. "The first call wasn't to my supervisor," he admitted. "It was to Commander Chen. I asked her to reach out to your old command, to let them know that you needed people who understood what today meant." The second call was to Agent Morrison. She has connections throughout the federal law enforcement community, and I knew she could gather people who respect what we do. The third call was to the chaplain, asking him to delay the ceremony by 30 minutes to give everyone time to arrive. I turned to face him, studying his profile in the soft light that spilled from the club windows. "You orchestrated all of this in 3 phone calls?" He shrugged, the gesture somehow both casual and profound. "I know what it feels like to be let down by family, but I also know what it feels like to be lifted up by the people who choose to stand with you. Today wasn't about replacing what you lost. It was about celebrating what you've built." As we prepared to leave, heading to a small inn on the Chesapeake Bay for our brief honeymoon, I caught sight of that same figure from the chapel. Still in dress uniform, still maintaining his distance, still watching from the shadows. This time, however, something was different. The rigid posture had softened slightly, and even from a distance I could see the weight of regret in his stance. Ethan noticed my gaze and followed it to the figure by the trees. Want to talk to him? I considered the question, weighing years of hurt against the possibility of reconciliation. Not tonight, I said finally. Tonight belongs to us, and to the people who chose to celebrate with us. If he wants to talk, he knows where to find me. As we drove away from Quantico, I reflected on the unexpected lesson of the day. My father's rejection, meant to diminish me, had instead revealed the strength of the community I had built through service and dedication. His absence had created space for people who truly understood my worth, to step forward and claim their rightful place in my life. The morning had begun with 5 words meant to break my spirit. We're not coming. Stay away. It had ended with hundreds of words of affirmation from people whose opinions actually mattered. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't what you receive, but what you discover you already possess. And sometimes the family that matters most isn't the one you're born into, but the one you build through choices, commitment, and the courage to be exactly who you are. Who you are. The honeymoon lasted 3 days. 3 days of quiet mornings, salt air, and the kind of peace that comes from finally understanding your place in the world. Ethan and I walked empty beaches, shared meals without checking our phones, and talked about everything except the shadow that had watched us from the chapel grounds. But shadows have a way of following you, even to places where you think you've left them behind. On the 4th morning, my phone buzzed with 17 missed calls, all from the same number, all from him. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold in my hands. 17 attempts to bridge a gap that had taken decades to carve. No voicemails, no messages, just the persistent ring of a man who had finally run out of silence to hide behind. Ethan found me sitting on the porch of our rental cottage, phone in one hand, wedding ring catching the morning light in the other. He didn't ask what was wrong. After 15 years in federal law enforcement, he could read the tension in a room like a weather report. Instead, he simply sat beside me and waited. The calls had started the night of our wedding. The first one came at 11:47, just as we were settling into our room at the inn. I had ignored it then, choosing celebration over confrontation, but they kept coming. Every few hours. Like clockwork. Like a man marking time until he could find the courage to speak. My father, Colonel Robert Lane, had never been a man of many words. Orders were given once, expected to be followed immediately, and rarely required explanation. Love, in his world, was expressed through discipline, approval through performance, and disappointment through silence. For 33 years, I had lived under the weight of his expectations, always falling short of standards that seemed to shift just beyond my reach. The irony wasn't lost on me that his first real attempt at communication in years came in the form of unanswered phone calls. Even in his desperation, he couldn't find actual words to bridge the distance he had created. Ethan's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, frowned, and handed it to me. The message was from his partner at the bureau, Agent Morrison. Thought you should know. Local PD in Fredericksburg called. Elderly man in army dress. Uniform found sitting in chapel parking lot this morning. Refused to leave. Gave your name as contact. Situation handled quietly. I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, not sympathy, just recognition. He had stayed. After watching from the shadows during our ceremony, after 17 unanswered phone calls, he had returned to the place where everything had changed. The chapel where I had been surrounded by chosen family while he stood alone in the darkness. The next call came while I was reading the text. This time, I answered. The silence on the other end was deafening. I could hear him breathing, could picture him in his study surrounded by commendations and photographs of a military career that had defined him more than fatherhood ever had. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had never heard before. Avery. Just my name, spoken like a question he didn't know how to ask. Yes, sir, I replied. falling back into the patterns that had shaped our relationship for decades. I saw the wedding from outside. I couldn't. He stopped, the words catching somewhere between pride and regret. I couldn't walk in there and pretend I deserved a place among those people. The honesty in his admission caught me off guard. For the first time in my memory, he sounded uncertain, stripped of the authority that had always defined him. I waited, understanding that this conversation would unfold on his timeline, not mine. "They stood for you," he continued. "The whole room stood like you were someone worth honoring." "I am someone worth honoring," I said quietly. "I always was." Another silence stretched between us, filled with years of missed opportunities and misunderstood intentions. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more human than I had ever heard it. "I don't know how to fix this, Avery. I don't know how to be the father you deserved when I was too busy trying to make you into the soldier I thought you should be." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield, acrid but clearing. I looked out at the Chesapeake Bay, watching morning light dance on water that had carried ships to war and home again for centuries. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. Some journeys end where they began, but the traveler is forever changed. You can't fix the past, I told him, but you can choose what happens next. What I heard in the pause that followed wasn't calculation or strategy. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes from realizing you've spent a lifetime building walls that now imprison you. When he spoke again, it was with the tentative hope of a man reaching across a chasm he had created. Would you be willing to meet? Not as colonel and commander, just as... He struggled with the words, as if the concept was foreign to him. Just as father and daughter. The request was so simple, so human, that it almost broke my heart. Here was a man who had commanded respect from thousands of soldiers, who had been decorated for valor under fire, who had built a reputation on unwavering strength, and he was asking his own daughter for permission to try again. I looked at Ethan, who had been listening without comment. He nodded once, a small gesture that communicated everything I needed to know. Whatever I decided, he would support. Whatever healing or heartbreak lay ahead, we would face it together. "Yes," I said into the phone. "But not in uniform, not in your study surrounded by your achievements. Somewhere neutral, somewhere we can just be people." The relief in his voice was palpable. "Arlington," he suggested. "Your mother's grave. If that's not too..." "It's perfect," I interrupted. She always believed in second chances. We agreed to meet the following Saturday, giving us both time to prepare for a conversation that was 33 years overdue. After hanging up, I sat in the morning quiet, trying to process the shift that had just occurred. The man who had abandoned me on my wedding day was asking for forgiveness. The father who had measured my worth in achievements was finally ready to see me as a person. Ethan reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. "How do you feel about it?" "Scared," I admitted. "Hopeful, angry, grateful. Sometimes healing hurts worse than the original wound." He squeezed my hand gently. "You don't owe him anything, Avery. Not forgiveness, not understanding, not a relationship. This is about what you need, not what he wants." I knew he was right, but I also knew something else. Carrying anger is exhausting. I had spent 15 years proving myself to a man who refused to see my worth. Now he was finally asking to look. The question wasn't whether he deserved the chance, but whether I deserved the peace that might come from giving it to him. The drive back to Virginia felt different than our journey to the coast. We were returning not just as newlyweds, but as a couple who had weathered their first real test together. Ethan's 3 phone calls had given me a wedding surrounded by respect and love. Now we would face whatever came next as partners, equals, two people who had chosen each other despite the complications that came with our histories. Saturday morning arrived gray and cool, with the kind of overcast sky that makes Arlington National Cemetery feel even more sacred than usual. I dressed carefully, choosing civilian clothes that felt both respectful and comfortable. No uniform, no symbols of rank or achievement. Just a daughter preparing to meet her father on ground that belonged to both of them. Ethan offered to drive me, but I declined. This was a journey I needed to make alone. As I pulled into the cemetery parking lot, I saw him immediately. He stood beside my mother's headstone, no longer the imposing figure I remembered from childhood. Age had softened his edges, and civilian clothes made him look smaller, more vulnerable. He turned as I approached, and for a moment we simply studied each other. I saw the gray in his hair, the lines around his eyes, the weight of regret in his posture. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me. The stubborn little girl who had polished his boots? The officer who had exceeded his expectations? Or simply a woman he had failed to know? "Hello, Avery," he said, and the greeting carried none of his usual formality. "Dad?" I replied, testing the word that had felt foreign for so many years. We stood there in awkward silence, two people who shared blood but had built separate lives. The headstone between us bore my mother's name, and the dates that bracketed a life cut too short. Ellen Marie Lane, beloved wife and mother. She would have known what to say in this moment. She had always been the translator between his rigid expectations and my rebellious spirit. "I brought something," he said finally, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small velvet box, the kind used for military decorations. Inside, nestled in blue silk, was a medal I had never seen before. The Navy Distinguished Service Medal, my name engraved on a small plaque beneath it. "I was supposed to present this at your promotion ceremony last year," he explained, "but I couldn't." I wasn't ready to admit that my daughter had become everything I claimed she could never be. The medal caught the gray morning light, its ribbon colors reflecting the service I had given and the recognition I had earned. But it wasn't the decoration that moved me, it was the admission that came with it. For the first time in my life, my father was acknowledging not just my achievements, but his own failures. "Why now?" I asked. "Why after all these years of silence?" "Because I watched you walk down that aisle surrounded by people who saw what I refused to see," he said. "Because I realized that my pride had cost me the most important relationship in my life. Because your mother would never forgive me if I didn't try to make this right." The mention of my mother broke something loose in my chest. She had been the buffer between us, the one who smoothed his harsh edges and encouraged my dreams. Without her, we had lost the only person who spoke both of our languages fluently. "I miss her too," I said quietly. "Every day." "She was so proud of you," he replied. "Used to show me every newspaper article, every promotion announcement." I pretended not to care, but she knew. She always knew. We talked for over an hour, standing beside the grave of the woman who had loved us both. The conversation wasn't easy. Years of hurt don't dissolve with apologies, and trust isn't rebuilt with good intentions. But it was a beginning, a tentative first step toward understanding. When it was time to leave, he made one more request. Would it be possible for me to meet your husband? Properly, I mean, not as strangers in a parking lot. I thought of Ethan, waiting at home with coffee and patience, of the 3 phone calls that had saved my wedding day, of the man who had chosen to love me completely, family drama and all. "I think he'd like that," I said. "He's the one who made sure I had people standing with me when you couldn't." My father nodded, understanding the implied criticism but accepting it as deserved. "I'd like to thank him for that, for seeing what you needed when I was too stubborn to provide it." As we walked toward our separate cars, he stopped and turned back to me. "Avery, I know I can't undo the past, but if you'll let me, I'd like to try to be the father you deserve now, instead of the one I thought you needed then." The offer hung between us, fragile but sincere. I thought of the girl who had polished his boots, hoping for approval that never came, of the woman who had built a career on her own terms, earning respect from strangers while her own father remained silent, of the bride who had walked down an aisle surrounded by chosen family while he watched from the shadows. I'd like that too, I said finally, but it's going to take time and patience and the understanding that I'm not the same person who left for the Naval Academy 20 years ago. He smiled then, the first genuine smile I had seen from him in decades. Neither am I, he said. Maybe that's a good thing. The drive home gave me time to process what had just occurred. The conversation with my father had been painful, hopeful, and necessary in equal measure. There were no guarantees about what our relationship would become, but for the first time in years, there was possibility. Ethan was waiting when I got home, coffee still warm, newspaper unread. He looked up as I entered, reading my face the way he read case files, searching for clues about how the mission had gone. "How was it?" he asked simply. "Hard," I said, sinking into the chair beside him. "Good. Complicated. He wants to meet you." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Should I be worried?" I laughed, the sound surprising us both. "Only if you're afraid of a 70-year-old man trying to figure out how to apologize for 30 years of mistakes." "I think I can handle that," he said with a grin. "After all, I've already met your chosen family. They're much more intimidating than one reformed colonel." That evening, as we sat together on our couch planning the dinner that would bring my father into our home for the first time, I reflected on the strange turn my life had taken. A week ago, I had been abandoned on my wedding morning by a man who couldn't see past his own pride. Today, that same man was asking for a chance to build something new from the ruins of what we had lost. The healing wouldn't be quick or easy. Trust, once broken, requires careful rebuilding. But as I looked at Ethan, at the man whose 3 quiet phone calls had saved my wedding day, I realized something important. Family isn't just about blood or shared history. It's about showing up, standing together, and choosing love over pride. My father was learning that lesson late, but he was learning it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin again. The dinner took place on a Tuesday evening in October. I had chosen Tuesday deliberately, a weeknight when expectations felt lower and the weight of ceremony couldn't settle into our small dining room. Ethan arrived home early, loosening his tie but keeping his shirt pressed. He understood that first impressions with my father would be measured in details. Posture, eye contact, the firmness of a handshake. My father arrived precisely at 1800 hours. Old habits, apparently, die harder than pride. He stood on our front porch in a navy blazer and khakis, holding a bottle of wine like a peace offering. When I opened the door, he looked smaller than I remembered, less like the commanding officer who had shaped my childhood, and more like a man trying to navigate unfamiliar territory. "Colonel Lane," Ethan said, extending his hand before I could make introductions. "Agent Cole. Thank you for coming." The handshake lasted exactly the right amount of time. Not too brief to suggest dismissal, not too long to imply desperation. My father's eyes met Ethan's directly, and I watched something pass between them. An understanding, maybe, or at least a willingness to try. "Agent Cole," my father said, his voice carrying the measured tone he used when testing new ground. "I believe I owe you a debt of gratitude." The conversation that followed was careful, like 3 diplomats negotiating a treaty none of them fully understood. We talked about the weather, the traffic, the quality of the wine my father had brought. Safe topics that allowed us to observe each other without revealing too much. But beneath the surface pleasantries, something more significant was happening. Ethan asked about my father's service, not in the way civilians do when they're fishing for war stories, but with the specific curiosity of someone who understood the weight of duty. My father responded by asking about federal law enforcement, about the difference between military command and civilian leadership. They were feeling each other out, these 2 men who had both chosen to serve something larger than themselves. The real breakthrough came during dessert. Ethan had made his grandmother's apple pie, a recipe that required patience and precision. My father took a bite, paused, and said something I never expected to hear. "This reminds me of Ellen's cooking," he said quietly. "She used to make something similar when Avery was small. It was the first time he had mentioned my mother in my presence since her funeral 5 years earlier. The words hung in the air like a bridge he had just decided to cross. Ethan didn't fill the silence with empty condolences or awkward sympathy. He simply nodded and said, "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," my father replied, his voice catching slightly. "She understood things I never could. How to love without conditions. How to be proud without keeping score." I felt my throat tighten. This was the closest thing to an apology he had ever offered. Not a direct acknowledgement of his failures, but an admission that he recognized a different way of being in the world, a way my mother had embodied and I had somehow learned despite his resistance. After dinner, we moved to the living room. My father sat stiffly on our couch, hands clasped in his lap like a man waiting for orders. Ethan settled into his usual chair, relaxed but attentive. I took the space between them, literally and figuratively, still learning how to navigate this new dynamic. "I have something to ask you both," my father said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar hesitation. "I know I don't have the right to make requests, but I'd like to try to be part of your lives. Not the way I was before, but differently. Better." The request was so simple it almost broke my heart. Here was a man who had commanded respect through authority his entire life, asking permission to earn it through relationship. The vulnerability in his voice was startling, like seeing someone remove armor they had worn so long you forgot they were human underneath. Ethan spoke first, his tone diplomatic but firm. "Colonel, I think I can speak for both Avery and myself when I say that we're willing to try. But it has to be on equal terms. Not as officer to subordinate, but as family members who are learning to know each other." My father nodded slowly, processing the boundaries that were being established. "I appreciate your directness, Agent Cole. I'm not accustomed to negotiating relationships, but I understand that what I'm used to hasn't worked." Over the following months, we developed a routine. Sunday dinners, usually at our house, but occasionally at his apartment near Fort Belvoir. The conversations grew easier as we learned to talk about subjects that didn't carry the weight of our history. Current events, books, the small details of daily life that make up the texture of relationship. Ethan proved to be the perfect mediator, asking questions that drew my father out without pushing too hard. He had a gift for finding common ground, highlighting shared values between a career military officer and a federal agent. Both men understood duty, sacrifice, the peculiar loneliness that comes with positions of responsibility. But it was during a dinner in November that the real healing began. My father arrived carrying a manila folder, the same kind he had used throughout my childhood to organize important documents. He set it on our coffee table with the care reserved for something precious. "I brought some things I thought you might want to see," he said, his voice uncertain. "Pictures, mostly. Things your mother saved that I couldn't bear to look at after she died." Inside the folder was a treasure trove of memories I never knew existed. Photographs of my graduation from the Naval Academy, newspaper clippings about my promotions, copies of commendation letters. My mother had collected them all, creating a record of achievements my father had apparently noticed but never acknowledged. There was more. Report cards from elementary school with notes in my mother's handwriting about how proud she was of my determination. An essay I had written in 5th grade about wanting to serve my country, decorated with gold stars from a teacher who saw potential where my father saw stubbornness. "She showed these to me every time you accomplished something new," he said quietly. I pretended to dismiss them, but she kept them anyway. She said someday I'd want to remember what I was too proud to celebrate. The most devastating item was at the bottom of the pile, a letter in my mother's handwriting, addressed to me but never sent. The date showed it had been written just weeks before her death. "My dearest Avery," it began, "your father loves you more than he knows how to show. His pride isn't in your failures, but in his own inability to express what your successes mean to him. Please don't let his silence convince you that you aren't everything he hoped you would become. You are his greatest achievement, even if he can't find the words to say so. I read the letter 3 times before I could speak. When I finally looked up, my father's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She wrote that for you," he said. "But she was writing it for both of us." That night, after my father left, Ethan and I sat together processing what had just occurred. The folder of memories sat open on our coffee table, a testament to love that had been present but hidden, acknowledged but unexpressed. "Your mother was quite a woman," Ethan said softly. "She saw what both of you needed before either of you understood it yourselves." I thought about the woman who had bridged the gap between my father's expectations and my own dreams. She had died believing that someday we would find our way back to each other. Tonight, for the first time, I believed she might be right. The Christmas season brought an unexpected gift. My father asked if he could host dinner at his apartment, the first time he had invited us into his space since we had reconnected. The place was exactly what I expected. Neat, organized, dominated by military memorabilia and photographs of a career that spanned 3 decades. But there were changes. New pictures sat on his mantel. Our wedding photo, a snapshot Ethan had taken of us at Arlington, even a casual shot from one of our Sunday dinners. He had made room for us in the museum of his life. The meal was simple but carefully prepared. My father had clearly put effort into making us comfortable, even going so far as to buy wine glasses that matched instead of the mismatched collection he had always used. It was a small detail, but it spoke to his desire to do better, to be better. During dessert, he made an announcement that surprised us both. "I've been thinking about retiring," he said. "Not immediately, but within the year. I'd like to have more time for things that, or matter. For people who matter." The decision represented a fundamental shift in his priorities. For 40 years, his identity had been entirely wrapped up in his military service. The idea of choosing family over career would have been unthinkable just months earlier. "What would you do with yourself?" Ethan asked, genuinely curious. My father smiled, an expression that was becoming more familiar. "I thought I might try being a grandfather someday, if that opportunity presents itself." The comment caught me off guard. Ethan and I had talked about children but hadn't made any firm decisions. The idea that my father was thinking ahead, planning for a future that included us, was both touching and terrifying. "That's a conversation for another day," I said diplomatically, "but it's good to know you're thinking about the future instead of just the past." As winter turned to spring, our relationship continued to evolve. My father began calling regularly, not with agenda or criticism, but just to check in. He remembered details about our lives, asked about Ethan's cases when security allowed, showed interest in my work at the Pentagon. The real test came in March when Ethan was offered a promotion that would require us to relocate to Chicago. It was an opportunity he had worked toward for years, but it meant leaving behind the fragile foundation we had built with my father. When we told him about the potential move over dinner, I watched his face carefully. The old version of my father would have seen it as abandonment, another example of my inability to prioritize family over career. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about the opportunity, the timeline, the impact on our future. "It sounds like an excellent career move," he said finally. "Your mother always said that home isn't a place. It's the people you carry with you. We'll figure out how to make this work." The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. We talked about visits, about staying, connected across distance, about the difference between physical proximity and emotional presence. My father acknowledged that he had confused the two for most of my life, demanding my physical compliance while remaining emotionally distant. "I don't want geography to become another wall between us," he said. "I've built enough of those already." In the end, Ethan decided to decline the promotion, not because of family pressure, but because he realized that what we were building in Virginia was worth more than any career advancement. The 3 of us had found something rare, a second chance at being a family. The decision surprised my father, who had always prioritized advancement over stability. When Ethan explained his reasoning, my father listened without interruption, then offered something I had never heard from him before. That takes wisdom, Agent Cole. The kind I didn't have when it would have mattered most. As our first year of reconnection drew to a close, I reflected on the journey we had all taken. My father had learned to express love without conditions. Ethan had proven that chosen family could be just as strong as blood family, and I had discovered that forgiveness isn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing to write a different future. The man who had abandoned me on my wedding morning had become someone I looked forward to seeing every Sunday. The father who had measured my worth through achievements had learned to value my happiness. It hadn't been easy, and there were still moments of awkwardness, still conversations that required careful navigation. But healing rarely happens in dramatic moments. It happens in small gestures repeated over time. In phone calls that serve no purpose except connection. In dinners shared without agenda. In the gradual rebuilding of trust that had been broken not through malice, but through misunderstanding. Looking back now, I realize that abandonment can sometimes be the greatest gift you never asked for. When my father chose pride over presents on my wedding morning, he inadvertently revealed something profound about the difference between family that claims you and family that chooses you. Ethan's 3 quiet phone calls didn't just save my wedding day. They showed me what love looks like when it's paired with action. While my father sent a text message designed to wound, my husband made connections designed to heal. One man tried to diminish me with his absence. The other elevated me with his presence. The uniform I wore down that aisle wasn't just fabric and ribbons. It was proof that worth isn't inherited through bloodlines or earned through approval. It's built through service, sacrifice, and the courage to stand tall even when the people who should support you choose to walk away. My father eventually learned what those Navy officers and FBI agents already knew. Respect isn't commanded through authority or demanded through expectation. It's given freely to those who earn it through character, consistency, and the willingness to show up when it matters most. The reconciliation that followed taught us all something valuable. Family isn't about perfection or the absence of mistakes. It's about the willingness to try again, to choose grace over grudges, and to understand that sometimes the strongest people are those who know how to say they were wrong. 3 phone calls changed everything. Not because they erased the pain of abandonment, but because they proved that when one door closes, love has a way of opening windows. Sometimes the family you build matters more than the family you're born into. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to have both. If this story resonates with you, remember that your worth isn't determined by who shows up or stays away. It's determined by how you choose to show up for yourself and for the people who see your value even when others cannot. Stand tall, choose wisely, and never let anyone convince you that their inability to love you properly is a reflection of your worthiness to be loved.